Three big things preoccupy me. First is the dramatic and seemingly never-ending number of competitors in the media sector. The second is the dramatic and seemingly never-ending growth in the number of shows, compelling content that is available to people. And third thing is a workforce that needs to transform and at an extraordinary pace to be able to meet the challenges of the media sector as it evolves over the next few years. So the first thing, which is the number of competitors, I think it's the single biggest shift in the competitive landscape, and it's the thing that happened when the internet got put on steroids. So now, what used to be things that people had to be able to do up a fake IP address to get are all now mainstream services. And I think for those of you who consume most of your televisual content over the internet, it may not seem like a huge transformation, but for the vast majority of people, even things like Netflix, which to them feel like a traditional television experience, they forget are an internet experience. And so Apple TV, Amazon TV, Hulu, CBS All Access, HBO Now, CTV Go, all of these providers, non-traditional providers who are streaming their content for all audiences, they're not hard to get, they're not hard to operate, they're often cheaper than what you pay for cable service, which is something you'll all know about, since I doubt how many people in this room actually pay for cable. Oh, not a bad number. I'm surprised by that. But most of them would actually be cheaper than traditional cable, right? If you're paying for an Ignite kind of Rogers high-speed internet service, and then you add on a Netflix at $9.99 and an Apple TV and a couple others, you're still not getting anywhere close to what the average cable bill is in a month. So the number of competitors is very, very real. And what all of them want is your attention for as long as they can get it. And what they've all realized is that the way to your wireless heart is to have great content. And there's a famous speech a few years ago made by a guy named John Landgraf, who's the president of FX. And he said, "I believe there is too much television. We have reached something called peak content." And I think he was right that there's too much television. I can't keep up with it. I'm sure you can't keep up with it. The number of shows that I am supposed to be watching, that not just to keep up with what is the competition doing, really wonderful content that just for my own viewing pleasure, never mind keeping up with trends, there is fantastic content out there. And, you know, my daughter could grow hungry and cold while I binge watch everything I'm supposed to watch, and I can't keep up. Where he was wrong was in saying we've reached peak content because it continues to grow. So when he made his statement 2 years ago, there were close to 400 new hours of scripted comedy and drama coming out that year, and this year there's 450. So we haven't reached peak, it continues to grow. And, you know, in a world where you have so many choices of what to watch, your brands and your marketing spend surely matter, but I cannot help but believe that the algorithms that Netflix and others are using are actually more compelling in terms of discoverability and putting things in front of people that they know they want to watch. So even if you can get audiences through great marketing, you have to have content that competes. And, you know, it's not a given that great content is expensive, but it is a unicorn indeed to find cheap, compelling content. It's not that easy. And so the spend that people are making on content continues to rise and rise. And I'll just give you a point of comparison. The LA Times did an article a few months ago where they speculated that the US networks, just the networks, and that's the conventional networks, not cable, not AMC, not those folks, spend anywhere from $60 to $100 million each just on pilot season. The entire entertainment programming budget of the CBC, so the non-news programming on television, is about 130, 140 million. So just what they're spending on pilots is our entire budget for the year for everything non-news. So it's very, very difficult to compete with that. So, you know, now I'm the walking dead because I'm not sleeping at all at night over these two problems. And my third problem is I have yet another worry, which is how do I attract, retain, and keep engaged a workforce that wants to use an agile management system, wants to be nurtured, wants to be engaged, wants to perform at its best, wants continuous learning, wants training and development, is inclusive, is non-hierarchical, and wants to be fully supported when they're in crisis. So those three big things are really the things that I think, oh, how do I solve for any one of those, never mind all three? So what are we doing? The first thing we're doing is investing very, very heavily in over-the-top technology so that we can deliver an audience experience for Canadians that matches what some of those giant technology companies are delivering for people. So as you sit and watch a Netflix show and you say, that was great, and up comes a thing that says, your next episode will begin in 10, 9, 8, 7. That's a beautiful experience for an audience. It's enjoyable. It keeps you engaged. It keeps you watching. The even more important thing is that is a learning system that starts to know what do you like, what kind of content do you like, what kind of stars do you like, what genres do you enjoy, and continues to deliver for you compelling content. So that's item one, investing in both the platforms, the data management capability that you need to deliver that personalization and customization. The second thing we're doing is investing as much as we can in content that's high quality and that sets us apart. We are leveraging our programming dollars by partnering with people like Netflix to deliver distinctively Canadian but high quality content. And so we're looking to say, how can we partner with the best in the world to bring to Canadians who pay for the CBC world quality content that is still distinctive and still Canadian. And so we're doing that. And finally, we're transforming our culture, not only by building a more diverse and more inclusive workforce. We're trying to shift our leadership culture to become more collaborative, more agile, less bureaucratic, looking for every opportunity we can to attract and retain employees who are comfortable in the zeitgeist and who can continually be engaged with us through different opportunities, whether they're in news or radio or digital or any of our other platforms.
In poll after poll, the majority of Canadians have indicated they want a strong national public broadcaster. They want groundbreaking news and current affairs journalism and distinctive Canadian drama and entertainment. The CBC should focus on national and international news to let Canadians better understand their place in the world. CBC should not duplicate the work of the private sector. The CBC needs a totally new funding formula. The crisis is not about money, it's about mandate and governance. How does the CBC plan to address all or some of those critics?
Well, I mean, I would say we are meeting our mandate our mandate fundamentally is to inform, enlighten, and entertain. I think poll after poll would also show you, and one was recently done that said the only people more trusted than CBC News for a source of information were scientific experts. CBC came second at 73%, and the rest of the media was a full 10 or 11 points behind CBC. I think that's a testament to the standard of journalism that we maintain. We certainly invest heavily in our local, national, and international news. You know, the challenge of the question around competing with the privates is if you have a mandate to entertain, you have to look at what is it that people are finding entertaining and deliver on that. I do think we, under my own tenure, if I may, started to reinvest in arts programming, started to invest in independent documentary film, radio documentary, which had kind of gone by the wayside. And as we've received new funds from the new government, we have put those funds to work in new programming, new international bureaus, pop-up bureaus, because you don't generally now establish a full operation. You create a pop-up bureau and you might put a journalist there for 4 or 5 months. Journalists tend to be able now to self-produce if they're technologically advanced. You know, I'm always surprised when people say don't compete with the privates. The privates in this country generally run American programming in prime time. And the reason that they do that is because you can buy an episode of a drama that's American made. You're just buying the territorial rights. So you can get those for $200,000, $250,000, $300,000. To create an hour of primetime drama in Canada costs about $2 million to create something that can compete with an American quality drama. So you take the 200,000, you take the 2 million. You cannot sell $2 million worth of advertising in prime time in Canada. You can't aggregate that big an audience on a regular basis to monetize that $2 million. So virtually every Canadian-made drama loses money. It's not like a hit one makes money. They don't. Even one that everybody watched would not make money. It is a money-losing proposition. To take a purchased show, an acquisition, for $200,000 that's a hit, like Big Bang Theory or something like that, that gets 3 million viewers, that you can make money on. So by definition, with CBC running 90% plus Canadian content in prime time, I'm not competing with the privates.
In 2015, Peter Mansbridge, the famed broadcaster and face of the network, attended and officiated at the wedding of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Director of Communications, Kate Purchase, in Italy. Ms. Purchase's job is to communicate on behalf of the Prime Minister, a duty that sometimes entails spinning the government message. How can Canadians be confident that the CBC is upholding the highest standards of objectivity when one of its most prominent broadcasters is privately vacationing with members of the Prime Minister's office? And should no conflict of interest truly have come about from this incident, isn't the appearance of one equally as damaging when it comes to journalistic integrity?
I think the accusation of bias has time and again been proven to not hold any water. We've had independent organizations do studies of CBC News where they look at tone, representation, how much time do you give to this party or that party, and we've pretty consistently come out as not biased. You will find periods when you have greater coverage of the party in power. They're governing. They tend to generate more news. So by definition of governing the country, they're constantly putting forward stuff that people want to cover. So, you know, if the Tories are in power, you will end up with an overrepresentation of Tory ministers might be appearing, but it's because Tory ministers are making announcements and governing the country, and the same thing will be true when somebody else is. You know, we also live in an age of echo chamber news consumption. So people tend to pick news organizations and information organizations that reflect their own views, and those that don't reflect their views are biased by definition. I don't agree with what you're reporting, therefore you must have a bias because I'm eminently fair. And so you've got a bit of that going on at all times. But, you know, I would put CBC News in the top 5 news organizations in the world in terms of credibility, our journalistic standards and practices, and our adherence to editorial policies that are fair and balanced. Peter Mansbridge having a personal life that then becomes conflated with, therefore he's biased, or he appears to be biased. I babysat Kate Purchase. I know Kate Purchase. I haven't seen or talked to Kate since she took her job in the PMO, or for 5 or 10 years before that. But I knew Kate Purchase when I worked at Hill and Knowlton in 1988, and she was 2 years old, and I knew her mom. And so I babysat her. So does that make me biased as the head of the CBC because a girl I babysat when she was 2 years old grew up to be somebody who worked in government? I don't think so. It's, you know, it's a tiny country. People are going to run into each other, and friendships will be made and unmade over the course of covering politics, being engaged with journalism. These are not giant thousands and thousands of people. It's often just hundreds of people. And so you can charge somebody with, yes, but it seems like you're biased. I don't think Peter Mansbridge gets up of a day and thinks for 30 seconds about whether what he's reporting on is going to make a good day or a bad day for Kate Purchase or anybody else.
An article posted by CBC News discusses CBC's request to the federal government to be funded $318 million toward the goal of becoming an ad-free network. You mentioned your reasoning for this proposal is to support Canadian media companies through investing in CBC's cultural policy. Could you please explain how $318 million of taxpayer money could assist in reshaping CBC's culture, and how that investment not only helps CBC, but the broadcasting sector? Also, do you think there may be a way to raise funds for this initiative instead of increasing Canadian viewers' fees by $12?
The vast majority of public broadcasters around the world in contemporary industrial countries are ad-free. They are supported by their governments, and CBC is, in fact, in a list of 18 of those, CBC is the 3rd worst funded public broadcaster in the world. Our proposal for the $318 million is to replace the advertising dollars that we currently get in the marketplace, and it's from both Radio-Canada and CBC, so we raise about 125, 130 a year, 130 million a year. Radio-Canada does as well. So you have to replace that. That's not an increase in our budget, it's just a replacement of the money that would then go likely to the other private broadcasters and private media companies. Not all of it would go to Canadian media companies. But we had Nordicity, which is an econometrics firm, do a study, and they said about 2/3 of that ad revenue that currently comes to CBC would go to Canadian media companies. So it would help them through this digital transition. The other part of the money is in part because you can't go to a producer. I don't know if folks know this, but the only thing that CBC produces in-house anymore is radio and television news. We don't make programs inside the CBC. So every dollar that the CBC spends on programming is actually given to an independent producer, and that creates a multiplier effect in the independent production sector. But you can't go to a producer and say, what used to be a 22-minute show, because we have 8 minutes of ads, you now need to produce a 30-minute show, but I'm not going to pay you anymore. So obviously you've got to replace that as well. So your costs of replacing that programming with ad-free programming go up. So it's not a big greedy ask. It would take us from being the 3rd worst funded public broadcaster in the industrial world to the 4th worst. And it's $1 a month per Canadian. I actually think people get incredible value for that. And the thing that I find gets lost in this conversation is what we really asked for was not, hey, make us ad-free. What we really said to the minister was, when we looked around the world at countries that were having success in creating an economic, strategic sector out of culture, they were countries that did things like Creative Britain. Creative Britain said, we're going to turn this sector into something where we have jobs, education, everything driving to create an export market for British design, British fashion, British architecture, British television, British films. It was across the whole creative sector. And what the report that we commissioned said was, if you actually did this, just this piece of it, and the other thing Creative Britain did was they made the BBC kind of a core foundational partner because the BBC touches so much of culture. It created, in Canada, it would create 7,200 jobs in the creative sector. It would add almost $500 million to GDP, and it would provide $355 million in labor income, so wages and salaries for people in the creative sector. I look at that and I say, those are good jobs. Every one of you would like a job in the creative sector. They're sustainable jobs. You can't outsource your culture. These are jobs that don't disappear. These are jobs that stay in the country, are good jobs, and you can make a career out of them. And the importance of investing in your culture, we're a country that's still inventing itself. We still need to tell each other what we care about. We still need to share values with each other about who we are. One of your papers that folks have been reading is said, why are we subsidizing the Canadian culture sector and protecting them from foreign ownership? And one of their pieces of evidence of why we shouldn't do this is because Canadians don't name the CBC as a reason for the protection. But the list of things that they do name are things they might not even know about if it wasn't for the CBC. So if you take it back a step, and instead of saying, CBC doesn't show up on the list, really, look what does show up on the list. Hockey shows up on the list. Hockey was on CBC for 65 years. Is that maybe one of the reasons hockey shows up on the list? Is it maybe one of the reasons hockey's a binding thing? A lot of the values, a lot of the things that Canadians care about are things that I think are supported by and identified by the public broadcaster.
My question today is, do you believe the proper means to create and broadcast Canadian content is through extra funding from taxing Netflix users? Or should we be more concerned about getting Canadian content on Netflix itself?
Netflix is the beast of the foreign content providers, and so people say it's a Netflix tax, and it's always characterized as a single company. I think the issue is, should people who participate in the benefits of selling their services to Canadians participate in the system that funds Canadian content? So the sort of social contract that's always existed around the creation of and support for Canadian content is that the cable companies and satellite companies have to reserve a portion of their revenues every year to a fund that funds Canadian content creation. So I think it's 5% of the revenues of Rogers, Shaw, Bell, TELUS has to go to the Canadian Media Fund. And then that money is matched roughly by the Department of Heritage. And that creates a big fund for Canadian program development. So the estimates are that Netflix, which is now in 48% of Canadian homes, takes in anywhere, and they don't disclose, and they're not, no one can find out. I think the chairman of the CRTC famously asked them for what they're taking out of Canada, but the estimate is anywhere between $300 and $500 million, on which they pay no taxes, and they do not contribute to the Canadian Media Fund. The same will be true. It's not, you can't just pick Netflix. They happen to be the biggest right now, but the same will be true of Amazon Prime or Hulu or any of the other services that start to be offered to Canadians. So, my view is if you get from the system, you should give back to the system, largely because that's puts you on a level playing field. And I'm in an odd position here because what I'm saying is, on behalf of Rogers, Bell, Shaw, and TELUS, yes, the others should also have to pay because otherwise it's not a competitive playing field. I'm not in the distribution business. I'm not required to put that money into that fund as they are. But I think it's a very legitimate argument for them to make. I partner with Netflix in creating content. I sell a lot of content to Netflix. So Netflix does have a lot of Canadian content. I've got people who come up to me and they say, have you seen the Netflix show Schitt's Creek? And I say it's a CBC show, but they've only seen it on Netflix, so they think it's a Netflix show. So they buy programming from us. We are co-producing content with them. I have a good relationship with Netflix. I know that they are subject to requirements in places in Europe where they have to put a certain portion of their revenues from that country into content creation in that country. I think it's 20% in a lot of countries of Europe. And they don't face any such requirement here. CBC is, somebody in their question said CBC is one of the largest media companies in Canada. CBC is one of the smallest media companies in Canada, believe it or not, because the rest of them are, not because we're national, we're radio and television, we're digital, but most of them are either owned by or partnered with what they call a vertically integrated telecommunications company. So Rogers is a conglomerate that owns City TV, Bell Globe Media owns CTV, Chorus owns Shaw and Global. So most of our competitors are actually part of much, much larger organizations. That said, I'm incredibly proud of the fact that CBC reaches 60% of millennials in this country every single month, and a lot of it is through our digital news sites. People in younger age groups believe in authenticity and the credibility of CBC News.
On behalf of Ryerson, I want to thank Heather.
Thank you so much. Thank you.